A sleepy little seaside community named Goleta, about 60 miles north of Los Angeles. An unlikely target for an enemy attack? Not to the Japanese Imperial Navy in 1942. During World War II, oil wells dotted the California coast. Any Japanese sub commander knew how much damage a direct hit with one of his deck guns could inflict. On February 23, 1942, as the sun went down, the enemy sub surfaced.
Along the Pacific coast, the hunt is on for the Jap submarine that brought the war to U.S. soil.
Well, at the time I was 15 years old, and I know I was very scared. We were all very scared.
I really got uncontrollably jittery. I suppose it was shock.
The Japanese submarine appeared off to the east here. It was a I-17, which is a large ocean-going submarine. It could travel about 6,000 miles without refueling.
Lying offshore, the Marauder opened up against oil refineries near the beach at Santa Barbara. Rigging and pumping equipment of one plant were shattered by a direct hit.
I was working away, and all of a sudden I heard explosions, bang, bang.
Aimed at those storage tanks, deck guns from only a mile offshore missed their mark.
And then we heard the sound of something shrieking through the sky.
There's the crater of a 5-incher, nearly big enough to hide that Jeep, big enough for all America to see.
We seen the flashes to the west, and my brother and I ran across the corral and climbed up on the barn, which is equal to a 3-story building. And in doing so, we could see the silhouette of the submarine.
We're talking about a 2-mile spread between where that flash was taking place and where we were hearing these shells land behind our house.
While it moved along the coast here, it fired 26 rounds of its 5.5-inch gun, which landed all over in the areas.
A piece of shell made in Tokyo. It did little harm, but it was the first fired in this war against our own shores.
This shell was the only one of the 25 approximately that were fired that never exploded because it landed in a field of a newly irrigated field of alfalfa.
As far as military invasions go, the submarine attack at Goleta was something of a dud. But the attack did hit home the very unnerving fact that Americans were not safe from foreign invasion, even in their own homes. And that was really the target of the Japanese submarine.
After we learned about the fact of a Japanese shelling, we were more concerned than we were before, of course. My father handed out deer rifles to all the ranchers up in the canyon to defend ourselves. We really felt we had to defend ourselves from an invasion.
The octopus of war embraces the world, war everywhere. In the Atlantic, the Pacific, the China Seas, the Indian Ocean, on all 5 continents. No American doubts now that this war is our war.
We didn't know if any Japanese had come off of the submarine or not.
Ruth Pratt was home alone with her children that night. Her husband had been away, training with the Civil Defense Home Guard.
I was so petrified once the shock set in on me that I saw more Japanese looking in the windows at me that night. Of course, there was nobody anywhere near me.
The Japanese sub had fired 27 rounds. Moments later, it slipped underwater and ran silently into the setting sun. But it left a clear message in its wake.
It was just to let us know that they could come that far.
A few days later, a broadcast on Radio Tokyo said the following: sensible Americans know that the submarine shelling of the Pacific coast was a warning to the nation that the paradise created by George Washington is on the verge of destruction. 4 months later, Japan struck another blow at America's home front and America's self-confidence. This time, a Japanese sub would target Fort Stevens, Oregon. The U.S. Army base was equipped with massive 10-inch cannons designed to guard against an invasion by sea. But the Japanese sub that surfaced near the fort on June 21, 1942, was hidden by the cover of darkness.
When the first shell hit, we figured that it was an invasion. That was our first thought in our household.
The Japanese, everything was going their way, and they were defeating everything in their path. And people out here on the coast were scared. They really expected, maybe it sounds foolish now, but expected to have an actual attack along our coast.
The Japanese submarine fired as many as 17 shells at the fort, and the soldiers inside prepared to return fire.
Battery Russell called in a few minutes and said, "Battery Russell, loaded and ready to fire." I repeated that to the colonel, and he discussed it with the other officers, and he turned back to me and said, "Tell them that I order them not to fire. I repeat, you will not fire." I gave this message to the operator, and he in turn turned to his officer and told him. And I heard over the phone, "Who in the hell gave that order?" And Colonel Doney was standing close enough to me that he could hear this message. And he told me, gave him the phone, and I did. And he said, "This is Colonel Doney. I told you you will not fire. If you fire one round, I'll court-martial the whole 249th.
The commanding officer believed that returning fire at night would only allow the enemy to get an exact fix on the positions of the fort's huge cannons. The decision not to return fire angered many of the soldiers who had been waiting anxiously to fight the enemy.
We all wanted to go and engage. I mean, we'd been in intensive training here for a year and a half, and here was our chance.
There was a lot of anger, and we feel that we should have been able to fire back.
By dawn, the submarine was out of sight. The only reminder of the attack, the scattered fragments of the Japanese shells that had exploded harmlessly around the fort. The next day, the men at Fort Stevens put up a makeshift sign challenging their sworn enemy, Japanese Emperor Hirohito, who had once again sent a submarine to test America's home defenses, physical and psychological, against invasion. But Japan was not ready to discard plans to attack Americans at home. In fact, it was in the process of developing an ingenious aerial assault, as we'll discover when In Search of History, U.S. Invaded continues. Elsewhere in the world in 1942, at Bataan in the Philippines, in the greatest defeat ever for the U.S. military, 76,000 servicemen under American command surrendered to the Japanese. At the Battle of Leningrad, troops from the Soviet Union began a major counteroffensive against invading German armies. And in a secret lab at the University of Chicago, Italian physicist Enrico Fermi achieved the first sustained nuclear reaction experiment. By 1942, the fighting had reached an unparalleled level. Battlefields dotted the world. German U-boats prowled throughout the Atlantic, often moving dangerously close to the American coastline. Anxieties about an impending invasion of mainland USA filled the air. It wasn't all a case of jittery nerves. Along the east